Hello everybody, my name is Professor David Gilbert. I'm one of the lecturers at RHUL Holloway and welcome to another of these RHUL Holloway Geography for Schools lectures. In this lecture what I want to talk about is the idea of place, and I think it's an interesting term. In some ways it's quite a difficult term for us as academic geographers to think about, and it's precisely because it's a common term. It's a term that people use in their everyday lives. And I think it can be difficult when words that are used in everyday language come to be the subject of academic analysis. We're perhaps used to hearing the word place used around us. We can think about someone saying, well, he knew his place, or she was put in her place, or I feel out of place, everything in its place. You might say to someone, hey, you've got a nice place here. Sometimes that's using place in a geographic sense. It's about an actual physical place in the world. Sometimes it's being used as a metaphor. Sometimes it's being used to think about place in terms of perhaps our social position. Even when we're just thinking about geographic places, it gets a bit confusing. You know, is a place big or small? What kind of scale does the word place refer to? How small does it have to be? Is a room in a house a particular kind of place? Well, yes, maybe it is. Is a house or a few streets, a neighbourhood or a village? But then we might think about bigger things. Sometimes we might talk about London or Manchester as a particular kind of place. Perhaps even talk about whole nations as being places. So there's a certain kind of vagueness to the ways in which it's used. Let's approach it in a slightly different way. Let's think about how we might contrast the word place with the word location. Both of those are talking about where we are, or talking about a particular position in terms of geography, but they work in a rather different way. I think location refers to the objective position in space. Perhaps we could measure that through latitude and longitude, or the kind of grid coordinates that you might use in an exercise with a map. Or maybe in this day and age you might be thinking about where we are on a GPS or a sat-nav system. Place, I think, is also about where you are, but I think it almost always includes more subjective elements. It includes elements of meaning, of experience and emotion. So sometimes perhaps one of the most powerful associations we have with the idea of place is the notion of home. And when we talk about home, yes, we may well be talking about a particular place, but we're also talking about much, much more than that. Let me give you an example. I'm sitting here recording this talk in my office at RHUL Holloway at the university, and I can give it a precise location. You know, it's 51.43 degrees north, 0.56 degrees west, if you want to do the latitude and longitude. Or I could pick it out on an Ordnance Survey map and identify exactly where I am. But if I think about what place I'm in, there's a whole set of other things that come into play. Perhaps I'm thinking about the nature of the university. I'm thinking perhaps about its history, how it came to be here, how it came to have the extraordinary architecture that it has. Or perhaps it becomes something that's about me personally. It's about my memories. It's about remembering when I first arrived here as a much younger lecturer. Or it's about remembering generations of students who've been through the geography department at RHUL Holloway and how that changed their lives and what they've gone on to become. Or it might be about my senses of the place. I might remember the place perhaps in thick snow in some hard winters, or as here in this particular picture, remember what RHUL Holloway feels like, what its campus feels like on a bright spring day. And all of those would be part of my conception of this as a particular sort of place. Now, geographers think about the notion of place in a number of ways. And what they're doing, I think, is picking up on those kinds of everyday, ordinary language uses of the word, but thinking about the sorts of specific ways that the word gets used. And I think we can identify perhaps 5 ways that geographers do think about the idea of place. They think about places as being bound up with what we've just been talking about, with senses, with emotions, with memories. They think about places as representations, so how do places get represented, get portrayed. They think about places as being associated with ideas of belonging, of rootedness, of sort of long, perhaps history, personal or family histories that are associated with a particular place. They think about places as contested and sometimes as exclusionary, sometimes places being about insiders and outsiders. And finally, and I think perhaps the most important way that geographers think about places, is that they think about places being made up of their connections and flows with other places. So an attempt to think about a place not just in terms of the characteristics that are local to it, that are kind of internal to that particular place, but to think about places as parts of wider systems of connections and flows of different things. Let's run through some examples of those. We've already started by thinking about senses, emotions, and memories, and that's a way of thinking about place that I think has become very important in academic geography in recent years. So different kinds of thinkers trying to think about what it means to have a fully sensed approach to particular places. How do our bodies, our sense of smell or touch or taste, or the ways in which we move through particular places influence our senses of those places? So that, I think, has become more important in recent years. But we might also think about the ways in which places, in some senses, are constructed for us, the ways in which places work through representation. A few years ago, the novelist Alistair Gray wrote about the power of representation, the power of the ways in which different people's imaginings about particular places influence the ways in which we understand them. He says, think of Florence or Paris or London or New York. Nobody visiting them for the first time is a stranger because they've already visited them in paintings, in novels, in history books and films. And I think that's a very powerful way in which place works in the modern world. You know, if we talk about New York or we talk about Paris, for many of you who perhaps haven't been to those particular places, you'll have a very strong idea of what they look like. Or indeed, if we have been there and then we see a representation, that triggers memories or it shapes the ways in which we understand those places. I don't know if any of you have been watching The Undoing over recent weeks, but I think for many of us who perhaps do know New York reasonably well, in this year of all years, suddenly seeing that place again and seeing it full of life was extraordinarily powerful, that we were in some senses experiencing a particular kind of New York through the way that it was represented in that Netflix series. And I think for many places, those representations can be incredibly powerful. They may also introduce us to the ways in which different people from different backgrounds, different people with different histories and experiences may understand the same place. So a selection of novels there about modern London. Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners, about migrants from the Caribbean in the 1950s. Charles Dickens' Bleak House, about the 19th century experience of London. And Monica Ali's book about the East End of London and particularly the Bangladeshi community, Brick Lane. Each of those representing the city as a distinctively different kind of place. Representations take other forms. We might go back and think about the extraordinary scenes at the beginning of the 2012 Olympics, and perhaps the ways in which those were a representation of place in certain kinds of ways, of northern industrial towns, or the English village and the English landscape. Places get represented in tourism as well. So we might think about the ways in which travel guides, or perhaps increasingly travel blogs or TripAdvisor, take a particular place and represent it in a particular way. It's not necessarily a full, a whole, a rounded representation of place, but it shapes our expectations if we are to travel to those places. A third way that we think about place is through the ideas of belonging and rootedness. That very often what we have is a very, very strong and powerful bond with particular kinds of places. The two images here convey, I think, very strong senses of that powerful sense of belonging. A street party in the East End of London at the end of the Second World War, a kind of celebration of survival, but a celebration of a very tight community that belonged to a particular part of the city, a part of the city that had experienced bombing, that had experienced very, very hard times. Or we might think about English villages as a particular kind of space of belonging and rootedness, people talking about how their ancestors had belonged to a particular village, how they'd grown up in that particular kind of society and community, a strong sense of belonging and bondedness to a particular place. I think that sense of place can also be about safety and refuge in a changing and uncertain world. I think for many of us this year, in 2020, there's been a kind of renewed appreciation of the sort of importance of home. Those of us that are lucky enough to have gardens, the importance of those spaces, the importance of that kind of deep and close relationship with a particular place during the periods of lockdown, I think were enormously important. Related to that, I think places are sometimes contested. I think sometimes the ways in which we relate to places is about the ways in which they are subject to change, perhaps powerful changes associated with the growth of the global economy, with forces that sometimes feel far more powerful than us. We might think about campaigns against gentrification, campaigns against the transformation of certain districts and certain places within cities. Here are some examples here about the campaigns to try and save a series of small communities, small villages, particular kinds of places on the edge of Heathrow Airport. There's a campaign about the village of Harmondsworth, trying to oppose the development of a third runway there. So I think sometimes places are contested and are sites of resistance to change. But I think too there's also a more disturbing side to that nature of place, a kind of darker side of belonging. Sometimes places become associated with exclusivity, associated with exclusion of different people. Sometimes the places that people find important to them, the ways in which they assert that importance is through saying, this place belongs to us, our particular group are rooted here, other groups are not welcome, outsiders are not welcome. And there is a kind of long and somewhat disturbing history of that from, clearly places like the American South in the 20th century, apartheid South Africa, but also examples in Britain right up to the present day, where sometimes a construction of place as being about belonging, being about rootedness, is an exclusion of others. And I think in extreme examples, those kinds of contests about place, that kind of, I think, struggles between different groups of people to assert their belongingness, their rootedness, leads to actual warfare, to conflict. What we're seeing today in 2020 is the latest phase of a long running dispute in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And in some ways that's a war between two post-Soviet nation states. But it's also a war that's about the definition of place, is about who particular places belong to, whether they belong to particular religious groups, particular ethnic groups. And we've seen a kind of process of conflict, of what sometimes is called ethnic cleansing, taking place in that conflict. So that in some ways is a rather depressing way of thinking about the nature of place. And I think the ways in which geography, particularly in the 20th century, has moved towards trying to think about places as being made through connections and flows is, I think, in some ways an attempt to regain a more positive sense of place. This is particularly associated with a very famous geographer who unfortunately died 3 or 4 years ago, a geographer called Doreen Massey, who wanted to say, are there ways in which we can think about places, not so much as enclosed, not so much with hard boundaries and that sense of insiders and outsiders, but is there a more positive way of thinking about places as being distinctive positions in wider networks of connections and flows? Can we think of a way of thinking about place that doesn't see them as closed containers, but thinks about different kinds of interactions with places beyond? We're perhaps familiar to thinking about the nature of places in economic systems. So what gets made in a place depends on who else will buy the things that are made in that particular place. Or in terms of the way that consumption influences the nature of place. So what do we buy? What do we consume? How are we connected in a particular place to distant other places? Or we might think about flows of people. We might think particularly about migration and the way that that changes and shapes places over time, that no place is static, no place is occupied by exactly the same groups and kinds of people that have always been there, that in some senses they are always open and changing and shifting in terms of what they are. Okay, so 5 ways that we might think about the nature of place. And actually perhaps an exercise for you or a challenge for you might be to take a place that's familiar to you and try to think about how each of these might work in the places around you. And one tip, I guess, we talked at the start about how places might be at different scales. Keep it small, keep it tight, keep it local, and think about the ways in which those kinds of places work. In some senses, if you take the whole of London or the whole of Manchester or the whole of Birmingham, it's perhaps rather easy, but also perhaps rather, I don't know, a bit diffuse to think about place for something as large as that. So take streets around you, or take a more localised example. I've done that, or I've thought a bit about that, for the place that I live in. So I live in a West London suburb. This isn't my street, but it's a street just around the corner from where I am. Firstly, this is a place that has very strong and powerful emotions, memories, engages my particular senses. When I think about my place, I think about the times that I walk the children to school. I think about the neighbours around me. I might think about the parks in this particular part of West London. I still just about manage to get out for regular runs, and part of the way that I experience that place is through moving through it, is through experiencing the changes in the weather and the changes in the seasons in that particular place. So I experience it through senses, through emotions, through memories. It's also a place that's represented. There are people that will promote this particular suburb. So this is Ealing, the queen of the suburbs, and celebrate Ealing and its quality of life and what kind of a place it is. Also, my kind of part of the work that I do is about the geography of suburbs, and I know only too well that there's a very long history of people being rather less celebratory in the way that they represent suburbs and suburbia. So there's just one example. This is Lewis Mumford's very famous book, The City in History, where he kind of writes off suburbs as kind of secondary and unimportant and dull and obsessed with consumption. There's perhaps a long tradition in TV shows and sitcoms and novels that very gently, or perhaps not so gently, are taking the mickey out of suburbs and suburbia. We might think of it as a place about belonging. Just down the road from me is Brentford. And these are the pubs that famously are on the four corners of the old Brentford football ground at Griffin Park. And Brentford, as you may or may not know, have just moved to a new stadium about half a mile away from the old stadium. But what you heard as that stadium shut, or as the old ground shut, was a sense of movement, a sense of the power of belonging and rootedness that some supporters, some families had to that particular part of West London. They would talk about how my father and my grandfather have always supported this particular club, that we've always been here. And I guess if you think about that and unpick that, what you see is this kind of constant tension that there is very often in the ways in which people talk about places, between that sense of rootedness, that sense of belonging, that sense of being in place for long periods of time, and the sense of movement and flows. Brentford and certain parts of Brentford feel like a very old, very established community, that there are indeed families who've lived there for 100 or 150 years. But also that Brentford was a place of dramatic change and movement in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a place that was growing. It was a place that was dependent on the expansion of London, on the growth of the railways and the growth of other kinds of industries. Brentford has quite a strong Irish community, many of which have been there for a very long time, but in a sense is both therefore about belonging, but also about connection to other places. We can find examples around me of contestation, of the ways in which places may reflect the kinds of conflicts or tensions between particular groups. This rather nice building is a youth centre that isn't very far away from me. It's a centre that does fantastic work supporting young people who've been in trouble with the criminal justice system, supporting some young people who've had issues with drug and alcohol abuse. But, as you might imagine, it's not entirely a popular development with some of its neighbours in these quiet suburban streets. And one of the things that you can see very visibly is the way that the local council has tried to regulate that particular place, has introduced a public spaces protection order to stop people doing particular kinds of things. You can't hang around in groups. You can be asked to surrender drink if you're drinking on the street. And so the police and local council officials have powers in this particular place to regulate the behaviour of certain people around this particular particular centre. There is a kind of contestation going on between different groups in this particular place. Interestingly, that same notice that I just showed a picture of features in this next picture, but in a rather different context. These aren't people loitering in this particular place. These are people holding a very large and very public ceremony that takes place each August. It didn't obviously take place in 2020, but has taken place for the previous decade, which is a huge festival that's associated with a local Hindu temple. And each August, the deities from the local temple are placed in these extraordinary, elaborate chariots and are paraded round the streets of West London, around the streets of this particular part of Ealing. And there are musicians, there are people rolling in the street, and it's an extraordinary transformation of these suburban streets in this part of West London. And I guess what that does is draw our attention to different kinds of networks and flows. This particular temple is associated with a Tamil community, a community particularly from the north and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. It's a community that is clearly here in this particular part of West London, in part because of a longer history of connection and flows, and particularly about the presence of the British Empire in South India. It also reflects events that have taken place more recently, but at a distance. So the nature of this community has been affected by ethnic disorder and civil war that's taken place within Sri Lanka. So the kinds of migrations and movements are part of the story of this particular place. But I think we can think about other kinds of connections and flows that are associated with this. I mean, the festival itself draws upon particular connections with South Asia. So there are musicians and craftspeople come to play their music, to make those elaborate chariots that you saw being taken around the streets of West London, and come from South Asia, come from either South India or the north and east of Sri Lanka, to participate in these kinds of events. It's an event that literally takes place in that part of West London, but is also connected to other parts of the world. So I think it's something that brings home that ways in which places need to be understood in terms of the ways in which they interconnect with other places. Okay, so what you might want to do then is to take these 5 ways of thinking about place. Thinking about places as a kind of immediate experience of senses, of emotions, of memories. Thinking about the ways in which places are represented. Thinking about the kinds of claims for belonging and rootedness in a particular place. Thinking about places as sites of contestation, sites of particular kinds of politics around place that very often work in terms of defining insiders and outsiders, defining who does belong and who does not belong. And then finally, thinking about the ways in which places work through connections and flows. How can we think about the nature of place in terms of their relationships with many, many other places? What are those kinds of systems and networks of connection and flow? Okay, thank you very much for your time. There's a question and answer session where I'm very happy to discuss place in more detail and think through some of your ideas about place, and that will take place next week on Monday the 14th of December. And if you need more information, the details are there. Thank you very much.